Okay, so let's talk about college readiness. A lot of times, parents and kids have a different idea of, are they ready for college? Kids will feel like they are, and parents might be like, oh, I don't know. It's ironic though, because one of the metrics for college readiness we eliminated due to the pandemic. And we're just starting to see it come back. So your ACT, your SAT, those tests were actually college readiness tests. The English and reading sections of both of those tests basically just work towards, Bella, come here. Sorry, we have a visitor today. Bella, over here. Work towards determining, does your child know the conventions of the English language? Do they know how to write well? Do they understand how to form a sentence? And while you might be thinking, well, of course, they're getting good grades in their English class, but college takes that level up a notch. Writing college papers is definitely different than writing high school papers. And I'll give you a really good example. So my son got decent grades in high school. He was pretty much an A student, an occasional B. And I remember it was the end of senior year and he had written a paper, and I walked into my home office and he's sitting there writing, and I picked up his paper, and I was not a helicopter mom, so I hadn't really seen much of his work. And I started reading it and I was horrified. I was like, how are you earning A's? It was along the lines of, I really like the color blue. I like the sky. It's the same color blue. Because the sky is blue, I really like the sky. I mean, it was just redundancy after redundancy. And I was like, you've got to be kidding me. You're earning an A and this is your work? And it's funny because we work with students on their essays for their applications, and I can tell you there's a lot of students who are not far from where he was who are earning A's in their classes, a lot across the board, different schools. And when he went off to college, he was a bio major. To him, English wasn't really that important. And he called me in a fit because his first bio lab paper, he got a C. All of the data was perfect. Everything, his experiment had been run properly. Every piece of information properly documented. He didn't follow the natural conventions in the English language for writing titles, headings, a synopsis. And she deducted until he was down to that C. And he's like, this is ridiculous. It's not an English paper. It's not an English class. I don't know why she's doing this to me. And I said, that last English paper I read of yours was horrible. I'm glad someone's doing this to you. Go to the resource center and learn how to write a paper. And that's what he had to do. But a lot of students don't know what to do. They think like it's an injustice when they get the bad grade because they're accustomed to getting decent grades in high school. So the English and reading sections on both the ACT and SAT, they're testing that. Do you know when to use a comma versus a colon versus a semicolon? Do you know how to conjugate nouns and verbs? And I realize this might sound simple, but if your kid is not scoring a 35, 36 on the ACT or a 700 or 800 on the SAT in the English section, they don't know those things. They don't. And the reason I bring this up is because these are college readiness tests. They were designed to see, could kids perform math and be prepared for the level of math in college? Can they write solid English papers? Can they write letters? Can they do all of those things that we kind of just expect them to do in college, research papers and so forth? And this year has been the lowest score in like over 50 years since the test began. The average had been hovering right around 21.8, 21.9. This last year, the average test score for the ACT was 19.8, a 2-point decrease. They attribute a lot of that to what happened during the pandemic as far as kids learning on Zoom, not being held quite as accountable for doing the right work. You know, the teachers were getting a lot of pushback, schools were getting a lot of pushback. Grading may have become a little bit easier because if my kid's not learning well on Zoom, they're only in class 3 days a week, how are they supposed to learn this? And so they had makeup tests, makeup corrections for, you know, things that they had wrong on tests. They weren't held to the rigor potentially that they had been before. And I'm not blaming schools, don't get me wrong. Like they were in a mess, like suddenly thrust into, our kids have to learn and no one's prepared. So I understand, but it's our responsibility now to make sure these kids know what to do and that we don't let future kids just slide and not be as prepared, because it's going to play out down the road when they're applying for internships, when they're applying for jobs, when their resumes are garbage, when they can't form a cover letter. And I see this happening. We have a whole alumni package for our students where we help them create their resumes when they're in college, help them apply to, you know, grad school and so forth, where we work with them on cover letters and internships. And, you know, sometimes we see like, okay, we really have to work on the verbiage here because it's not exactly how you'd want to say this. You know, you don't want to write as you speak. It should be more formal than that. And let's face it, what do? They text, they talk. The writing has kind of gone by the wayside. And so while a lot of people feel like ACT and SAT really aren't necessary, I'm going to give you some pushback on that. Studies have shown, Dartmouth did a study recently where students who submitted test scores, same GPAs, 4.0s. They took a huge sampling of all the students, 4.0s. Kids with test scores, kids without test scores. Kids with test scores were between like a 3.6 and a 4.0 in college. Kids without test scores, having submitted test scores, were closer to a 3.0. So that's a big difference, because if your child's coming out of college with a 3.0, how are employers looking at that? What if they want to go to grad school? Do they get into med school with a 3.0? Do they get into, you know, a master's program with a 3.0? It's things that we need to consider as we think about like what's really necessary right now. And testing, I think, gives your kid an advantage. Well, I see it in admissions. It gives your kids an advantage, but also the actual strategies and the information that they learn in test taking makes a huge impact on their writing ability, how well they convey messages, and that shows up down the road in everything else that they do. So just something else for you to think about when you're considering, should I have my kid take the test or not? Test optional we're seeing is going away. Purdue requires test, Tennessee requires test, Dartmouth requires test, a lot of MIT, a lot of schools are requiring them. But I'm going to tell you this, even the schools who don't are over 50% taking kids with test scores versus kids without in a lot of cases. The more selective the school is, the more likely that their acceptance rates for kids with test scores is much higher than those without test scores. So something for you as a parent to be aware of, because, you know, what's our job as parents? To set our kids up for success. So I want to bring this information to you so that you're not regretting the decision, so that the second kid down the line gets the benefit and the first kid didn't. So as an oldest child, I always wanted that benefit, and instead I was kind of like the test project. But this way, your oldest doesn't have to be the test project. You know that what's expected, who is getting accepted, typically has a test score, and you probably want to make sure that they get to test early. I love for kids to start taking the test by the end of their sophomore year. If you have a sophomore right now, that means April or June. The April ACT last sign up is this Friday without having to pay a late fee. There's May and June SAT. And I love those June tests because they're just coming off of finals, but yet they don't have anything lingering on their mind. Like it's kind of a blank slate getting ready for summer, but their brain's still kind of in test mode. So that usually makes a really great test. But by taking it early, they know exactly where they're at. They know what they struggled with. They're able to better articulate what the problems were and how different it is than testing in high school with information they just learned in the past week so that they can better prepare for that test during junior year and then knock it out of the park, instead of taking it for the first time during junior year and feeling like their back's against the wall and that they have no choice but to say, well, you know what, that's okay, I'll just go test optional, because it doesn't provide a benefit. So just thought I'd share that information with you. Again, these tests were created to be college readiness tests, to make sure that they could write at the level expected, that they could do math at the level expected, and that they were prepared for that leap. And we're seeing those scores go down, and that doesn't benefit our students. So if you have questions, drop a comment down below. Just drop the comment test and we can talk about it. Happy to talk to anybody about questions they have to make the whole process easier for you and your child.